Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me specially recognize my colleagues, the Honorable Ministers of Health and Information that are here today, and also the ministers that have joined us virtually, and also to recognize the Permanent Secretary, Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Accountant General of the Federation, the DG Budget of the Federation, DG DMO. We also have today the privilege of having the Senior Special Advisor to the President on National Assembly Matters, House of Reps, and I understand he's representing his colleague, his Senate counterpart as well, and all the heads of agencies that are here, members of the diplomatic corps, members of the civil society, but a special welcome to our brothers and sisters, gentlemen of the press. Good morning. So today is another round of another opportunity that we have to interact with you and give you an overview of the fiscal outcomes, or be able to report to you on the performance of the economy in 2021, give you an update of the 2021 budget performance, and also go through very quickly the global outlook and domestic developments, and discuss with you the underlying macroeconomic assumptions, parameters, and targets for the 2022 budget, as well as give you an overview of the revenue, the expenditure, and the deficit in the 2020 budget proposal. We'll also be showing you some of the critical sectors of the economy, the allocations we have made in the proposed budget. We'll also be presenting to you the strategic revenue growth initiatives that we have been undertaking that has helped us so far to ramp up revenue, and also that will help us to do even more in the area of revenue. And there is, at the end of the day, a selection of projects in the budget by sectors that we will be leaving with you. I do hope that you will visit the website of the ministry and the budget office later on, and actually download a copy of this report for your own review. You recall that yesterday, His Excellency the President laid the 2022 budget before the National Assembly. This tradition that has evolved underscores this administration's firm commitment to sustain the return to a predictable January to December fiscal year, as well as to enact annual finance acts to facilitate the implementation of the budget. So while yesterday what was presented was the federal government budget and the budgets, along with the budget of 63 government-owned enterprises, the finance bill work we are doing is not yet complete and will be completed within the month of October. Hopefully by November we can send that also to the National Assembly. You also remember that during the course of the year, we have to prepare a supplementary budget, which was costed at 982.73 billion. It was passed by the National Assembly on the 7th of July, and Mr. President assented to it, bringing the total appropriation for the 2021 budget to 14.57 trillion. That budget that we did, the supplementary budget, was necessary because we needed to make sure as a nation we have more resources to spend on security and on health. And on health specifically, we made provisions, additional provisions for the purchase of COVID-19 vaccines, as well as the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines across the country. The Nigerian economy, we all remember, lapsed into recession in the third quarter of 2020 after 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, but promptly emerged from recession within 1 quarter by the 4th quarter of 2021. The economy since then has sustained the recovery with the Q1 year-on-year GDP growth of 0.51%, as well as the 2nd quarter GDP report of 5.01%. This recovery was fueled by implementation of government's economic sustainability plan, and also the full funding of the 2020 budget, and it helped to ease the COVID-19 induced restrictions on economic activities. The growth was mainly driven by the non-oil sector, and that's the good story, which rose by 6.71%, masking the deterioration of the oil sector, which was measured at minus 12.65%. Other non-oil sector performance include trade at 22.5%, water supply and waste management at 18.5%, ICT at 5.5%, human and health services at 4.9% growth rates. The persistent rise of inflation was halted in April 2021 after 19 consecutive months, from a high of 18.17% in March 2021. The consumer index, which measures inflation, moderated for the fourth consecutive month to 17.01% in August 2021. With this downward trend, which is expected to continue throughout the year, we should be closing 2021 at a much healthier inflation rate. We do still have high unemployment rates, and these high unemployment rates have implications for poverty incidence in the population. The NBS fourth quarter 2020 estimates put unemployment at the rate of 33% and underemployment at 22.84%. So now, to give you an overview of the 2021 fiscal outcomes, an update on the 2020 budget implementation. Sorry, this is 2021 budget implementation. The 2021 budget parameters, if you recall, include, so I'm on slide 8 now, include an oil price benchmark, which was passed in the budget at $40 per barrel, but the actual over the course of the year up to August average is $65 per barrel. Oil production was passed at 1.86 million barrels per day. The average today is 1.57 million barrels per day. Exchange rate was 379 naira to the US dollar. The current exchange rate is 410, the NAFEX rate that is 410.15 naira per dollar. Inflation was projected to close at 11.97%, but we are currently at 17.01%. Growth rate was projected to be 3.0%. We're projecting a growth rate of 5.01% for the close of 2021. So the fiscal numbers that we're going to report today are preliminary, and they will be updated as reconciliations are done on a monthly basis, and the reconciliation is ongoing until the year closes. As at the end of August 2021, federal government's retained revenue was 3.93 trillion naira. This represents 73% of the target. That is the prorated revenue target as at the end of August, not for the full year. Federal government share of all revenue was 754.20 billion. This represents 56.3% performance of the prorated target as at August 2021, while non-oil tax revenues totaling 1.15 trillion represents 115% over and above the prorated target. Companies' income tax and value-added tax collections were 547.54 billion and 235.77 billion, respectively, representing 121% in the case of CIT and 148% in the case of VIT. And this is of the prorated targets. Customs collections at 338.66 billion represents 99% of the prorated target. Other revenues amounting to 1.71 trillion, of which the federal government independent revenue of 691.36 billion, while government-owned enterprises revenues was 873.52 billion. So the story here is that The revenue performance aggregate is 73%, but the fact is the non-oil revenue is performing very well above targets, while the oil and gas sector revenue is the one that is lagging behind. So slide 10 just shows you more granular numbers of the summary that I just gave. And then at slide 11 is an update on the expenditure performance of the 2021 budget as at August 2021. On the expenditure side, 8.14 trillion, representing 84%, has been utilized, and out of this amount, 9.71 out of the 9.71 trillion, that is the prorated expenditure from January to August. And this means 84% of the prorated target is the performance. This performance includes expenditure estimates of the government-owned enterprises, but this does not include project-tied loan numbers. Of the expenditure, 2.87 trillion was utilized for debt service, while 2.57 trillion was utilized for personnel costs, including pensions and gratuities. As at the end of August, 1.75 trillion naira had been expended for capital projects. Of this amount, 1.723 trillion represents 81% of the aggregate provision for MDA's capital prorated, while 36.01 billion is expenditure from government-owned enterprises. So slide 12 shows you more granular details of this performance. At slide 13 is some information that we have on the fiscal deficit financing. So you will see that we have a fiscal deficit of 4.299 trillion. This is against the prorated target of 4.610%. Sorry, 4.610 trillion. And how did we finance this deficit? This financing was done by utilization of 136.77 billion from proceeds of the sales of government assets through the privatization process, also by drawdown of multilateral and bilateral tied loans in the sum of 473.12 billion, and new borrowings of 3.659 trillion from both domestic and foreign sources. So let me now give you an update on the global outlook and domestic developments. Globally, the economy is projected to grow by 6.0% in 2021 and then down to 4.9% in 2022. In the euro area, growth is projected to be 4.6% in 2021. The recovery in the euro area is anticipated to be driven by pent-up demand and higher household incomes. China's economy is projected to tick up by 8.1% by the end of this year, and then goes down to 5.7% in 2020. So the global trend is growth is ramped up in 2021 and it goes down in 2022. And the reason being all the fiscal measures that were taken in 2020 and 2021 has pushed up growth very significantly, but that base effect wears out in 2021 and it normalizes in 2022. Nigeria's picture is the same. Africa, on the other hand, is going to be growing at a projected rate of 5.3% by 2022. Egypt, by the way, had a growth rate of 3.6% in the year 2020. And this is owing to very high domestic consumption. This is a picture that can also be the story of Nigeria because we have similar large numbers of population. It means we have enough numbers to actually drive consumption and drive the growth of the economy even by internal consumption processes. Economic activities in sub-Saharan Africa region are expected to pick up in 2021 and 2022, although not at the same rate. GDP is projected to expand by 3.4% in 2021, and in the case of Africa, is going up, unlike the rest of the world, to 4.1% in 2022. South Africa is expected to recover from recovery. They have currently a decline, a recession rate of 7.0%, as a minus 7.0%. They are expected to grow to 4.0% in 2021 and 2.2% in 2022. Nigeria's economy posted a 5.01% GDP growth year-on-year in the second quarter of 2021, signaling a rebound of growth in economic activities. The non-oil sector is a significant contributor to the economic performance in that second quarter, with a growth rate of 6.74%. The IMF has reviewed upwards Nigeria's GDP growth forecast to 2.5% and 2.6% in 2021 to 2022, respectively. On the 2022 budget, the IMF expects that during the course of the year 2022, the IMF expects that advanced economies will rebound from the 4.6% growth rate in the pandemic period, and then up to 5.6% in 2021 and 4.4% in 2022. Low-income developing countries' GDP is projected to accelerate by 3.7% in 2021 and then up to 4.9% in 2022. These projections indicate global economic recovery from COVID-19 induced contraction in 2021. Growth is expected to now moderate in 2022. So the underlying macroeconomic assumptions and parameters and targets that we had set for the 2022 budget proposal is showing on slide 18. The oil price benchmark that we have used for 2022 budget was $40, and 2021 was $40 per barrel, and at 2022 we're projecting $57 per barrel. The oil production we're projecting for 2022 is 1.88 million barrels per day, an exchange rate of 410 naira 15 kobo to the US dollar, an inflation rate of 13%, a non-oil GDP of 169.697 trillion naira, with an oil GDP of 14.684 trillion naira. The GDP growth rate that is projected for 2022 is 4.2%. This is against the IMF projection of 2.5%. And then the imports that we're projecting for 2022 will grow from 30 trillion to 33.118 trillion, while nominal consumption will also grow from 136.56 trillion to 149.39 trillion. The outer years follow the same pattern. The key assumptions and the basic framework is based on a number of research as well as consultations that we have had to conduct. So consumption is projected to surge in the medium term, growing from a revised rate of 139 trillion to 149 trillion in 2022, about 9.38% increase. This growth momentum is projected to be sustained, reaching 179.6 trillion in 2024. Nominal GDP is expected to rise from 168.6 trillion in 2021 to 184.38 trillion, and then up to 221.78 trillion in 2024. Real GDP forecast is 4.2% in 2022. Inflation is expected to remain above single digit in the medium-term horizon, given the structural issues impacting cost of doing business, including high food distribution cost. The steady decline is, however, expected to be sustained, seeing inflation dropping to 13% in 2022 and then down to 10% in 2024. So at slide 20, Although Nigeria's total production capacity is 2.5 million barrels per day, crude production is about 1.4 million barrels per day. And this is slightly short of the OPEC quota that has been assigned to Nigeria. But we do also have an additional 300,000 barrels per day of condensate, bringing the total to 1.7 million barrels per day. Oil production is projected to average 1.88 million barrels per day, this including condensates for 2022. The EIA expects that global oil production will increase to match the rising levels of global oil consumption. OPEC production is projected to average 28.3 million barrels per day in 2022, higher than the 26.94 million barrels per day in 2021, which means that we are hoping to get a higher OPEC quota from the current 1.4 million barrels per day that we have in 2022. World Bank forecasts that crude oil prices will rise gradually from an average of $60 per barrel in 2022 to $61 per barrel in 2023, and then up again to $61.9 US dollars per barrel in 2024. EIA sees 2022 oil prices averaging $66.05 dollars per barrel. So I've heard from yesterday that $57 per barrel is very pessimistic, but we are trying to be conservative, because we do have challenges in oil production, and also the market itself is very highly volatile and unpredictable. So the realities of 2021 portend sustained OPEC supply cuts. There will be cuts, maybe we do hope to get a slightly larger number. Ongoing vaccination and rebounding of global GDP led by emerging economies. In consultation with the NMPC and other stakeholders, our base oil scenario in the medium term is still $57 per barrel. And this is premised on the averages of leading forecasting institutions, factors affecting market fundamentals, global economic recovery, plans by governments, as well as market sentiments. At slide 23 is the 2022 budget overview of revenue and expenditure, as well as the deficit financing. So the next slide, which is slide 23, is to give you the rationale for the revision of the 2022 to 2024 MTEF. If you recall, the President had to send to the National Assembly early last week a request for the amendment of the MTEF, because the underlying drivers of the 2022 fiscal projections, such as oil price benchmark, oil production, exchange rate, GDP, and inflation, remain unchanged in the previous MTEF. However, there has been some key changes in the medium-term fiscal framework. The revision was necessitated by the need to reflect the new fiscal terms in the Petroleum Industry Act, the PIA of 2021, as well as other critical expenditures in the 2022 budget that were not anticipated at the time that we submitted the MTEF in July. The fiscal effects of the PIA implementation are assumed to kick in by the middle of next year, 2022. So the revised 2022 to 2024 fiscal framework is premised on this hybrid approach, that the status quo remains in terms of oil revenue from January to June based on the current fiscal terms, and from July to December, the terms will change to the new PIA fiscal regime, while 2023 and 2024 will now be based on the new PIA fiscal regime. The key impacts of these changes are as follows. First of all, the gross federation revenue projection has decreased by 341.57 billion from 8.87 trillion to 8.528 trillion. Deductions for federally funded upstream project costs and 13% derivation have also decreased by 33.3 billion and 810.25 billion respectively. net Federation oil and gas revenue projections has thus declined by an aggregate of 5.42 billion. So it is marginal from 6.54 trillion to 6.535 trillion. Despite the decline in Federation account revenue, the federal government's retained revenue is projected to increase from 8.3 trillion to 10.3 trillion. And I must go back to say that the decline in the revenue is as a result of the improved fiscal terms, which is designed to attract more investments in the oil and gas sector. The impact of it is government revenue is slightly reduced, but the expectation we're having and the indications will be so that more investors will come into the Nigerian market because the fiscal regimes are now quite competitive and attractive compared to comparator countries. So a projected increase in the retained revenues of government enterprises accounts for 837.76 billion. MDA's internally generated revenue has 6.976 billion that is being expected to be realized. We also introduced in the budget the education tax of 306 billion, which previously was not being indicated as federal government revenue, but we are now showing it as a federal government revenue. And when we go to the expenditure side, you will also see it as a transfer. So it's a pass-through. But what it's doing is actually recognizing the revenues of government. And the dividend of 8.3 billion from the Bank of Industry is also being updated in the MTF as an additional revenue line. The federal government share of oil royalty of 96.9 billion is expected to be transferred to the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, the NSIA, based on the provisions of the PIA. So we're recognizing this also as revenue, but we'll also recognize it as a transfer out to the NSIA as a requirement of the PIA. So summary for me here is that we have realized incremental revenues of about 1.6 trillion that is incorporated in the amended MTF, and these revenue lines are not coming from the oil and gas sector. They're from the government-owned enterprises, from IGR, as well as from education tax and dividends from Bank of Industry. The rationale for the revision of the 2022 MTF also had some inputs that we needed to adjust on the expenditure side. The increase on the expenditure side was motivated by the need to provide for additional critical expenditure, as well as to present a more comprehensive federal government of Nigeria budget. Some of these provisions that were recommended in the MTF and passed by the National Assembly include 100 billion additional provision for INEC towards advanced preparations for the 2022 general elections. Previously, we had provided 40 billion, which was the normal run rate for INEC, but for the elections, the expenditure is much higher than that. We also provided 40 billion for the National Poverty Reduction and Growth Strategy. This is a strategy that has been launched by Mr. President, and Mr. President has set up a special committee for implementation. This strategy has a major component of it, the upscaling of the existing social investment programs that are running and working well. We also introduced 178.10 billion provisions for population and housing census. The President has approved the conduct of the 2022 national census, and a proclamation will be made by Mr. President subsequently in this regard. We also recommended an additional 50 billion to be provided for police operations nationwide, 37 billion additional provision for MDA's electricity debts, 517.5 billion for multilateral, bilateral project-tied loans, as well as 54 billion to NASANI, which represents 1% federal government share of the Federation account. This is a provision that is required by the NASANI Act, and it has never been implemented. This is the first time we're doing it, and this is the recognition that science, technology, and innovation has become not only vital but urgent for us to give special attention to in the country. 305.99 billion has been provided for TED fund. That is the outflow that I discussed, that I presented earlier. The projected aggregate revenue available to fund the 2022 budget is 10.13 trillion. And this is inclusive of government-owned enterprises revenues. This revenue is 24.8% higher than the 2021 projection of 8.12 trillion. Without the government-owned enterprises revenue, the FGN revenue will be 8.4 trillion. To promote fiscal transparency, accountability, and comprehensiveness, allocations to TED fund and the budget of 63 government-owned enterprises are integrated into the 2022 Federal Government of Nigeria budget proposals. In aggregate, 34.9% of the projected revenues is to come from oil-related sources, while 65.1% is to be earned from non-oil sources. This puts the picture of the determination and the commitment of Mr. President and this administration of diversifying our economy from dependence in the oil and gas. And this is also further reinforced by the fact that when you look at the last GDP report, the contribution of the oil sector is just 7.4%. So the Nigerian economy is truly diversified. What we need to do is to deepen that diversification and also ensure that the growth that we hope to that we're aspiring to is inclusive. At slide 26 is a table that just shows you an overview of the revenue framework that I have just discussed. At slide 29 is further information on the aggregate expenditure that is proposed in the 2022 budget framework. The 2022 federal government expenditure, inclusive of government-owned enterprises, project-tied loans, is projected to be 16.39 trillion naira. This is 12.5% higher than the 2021 budget. Recurrent non-debt spending is estimated to be 6.83 trillion, and this is 41.7% of the total expenditure of government and 18.5% higher than what was passed in the 2021 appropriation. The aggregate capital expenditure of 5.35 trillion is 32.7% of the total expenditure. So this is to let me just emphasize that we had made a commitment from 2016 when the ERDP was passed that federal government expenditure will be a minimum, capital expenditure will be a minimum of 30%. So the past 2 years, we have not been able to reach that mark, so we're able to attain that 30% plus at 32.7% in 2022 budget. This provision is inclusive of capital component of statutory transfers, as well as government-owned capital and project-tied loan expenditures, which are loans for specific major ongoing projects in the country. At 3.61 trillion, debt service is 22% of the total expenditure of government in the proposed budget, and 35.6% of the total revenue in the budget. Provisions that have been made to retire maturing bonds to local contractors and suppliers at 292.7 billion is 1.79% of the total expenditure. This provision is in line with the federal government's commitment to offset accumulated arrears of contractual obligations dating back to over a decade. So we've been doing this consistently but gradually. At slide 31 is an overview of the deficit financing as well as some of the critical ratios in the 2022 budget proposal. The overall budget deficit is 6.26 trillion naira for the year 2022. This represents 3.39% of the gross domestic product. Budget deficit is to be financed mainly by borrowings, domestic and foreign, at the rate of 2.5 trillion each, multilateral bilateral loan drawdowns, which we project to be 1.16 trillion. So these are loans that have already been committed to and projects are ongoing, and privatization process of 90.7 billion. So it is interesting to just again emphasize that the total capital expenditure performance percentage is 33%. 33% of the total size of the budget, and that the deficit is at 3.39% of the GDP. Speaking about debt, we have had to resort to borrowing to finance our fiscal gaps. However, we believe that the debt level of the federal government of Nigeria today is still within sustainable limits. Borrowings are essential for us to be able to continue to deploy necessary capital expenditure as well as invest in human development. When you look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act, Section 41.1 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it is clearly provided for that the country can borrow for investing in capital expenditure and human capital development as long as the borrowing does not exceed 3.3% of GDP. This year, we have exceeded the 3% by 0.39%, and this also has been allowed in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, a provision that says that Mr. President can exceed the 3% threshold where there is a national emergency. And it is our collective view that the current security situation that we have, the need to properly address the economic conditions occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic and the crash of crude oil price qualify as national emergency. Having witnessed 2 consecutive recessions, we have had to spend our way out of recession, which contributed significantly to the growth of our public debt. It is unlikely that our recovery from each of these 2 recessions would have been fast without the sustained government expenditure funded partly by debt. To compound matters, the country has technically been at a situation where we have had several security challenges. With the pervasive security challenges across the country, there's a need for sustained funding of the security services. This has necessitated massive expenditures in security equipment as well as security operations, and this has contributed again to the fiscal deficit that we have. Defense and the security sector accounts for 22% of the budget expenditure for 2022. Nigeria's budget deficit is at minus 4.7% in 2021, and the debt to GDP ratios of 21.6% are the lowest amongst Nigeria's comparator countries. However, Nigeria's debt service to revenue ratio at 73%, this is actual, as at August, is the highest among African countries. And this, for us, is the concern. So the concern for us is that we have a revenue challenge that we all need to continuously address. The proof is that we don't have what a debt sustainability problem. The problem that we have is actually a revenue problem, and that's what we're working to address. Tax rates and compliance ratios are significantly higher in these countries that we're normally compared to. For example, Nigeria's VAT rate at 7.5% is the lowest in Africa, less than 50% of the African average. The slide at number 34, I don't know if you can read it, but the bar chart on the left-hand side shows the total debt to GDP levels of Nigeria, which is the first one at 21.6%. When you compare us to Angola, Angola is at 127.1%. Egypt is at 19% of their GDP. Ghana is at 73%. South Africa is at 77.1%. Kenya is at 68%. Senegal at 65%. So just to make the point that Nigeria's debt levels are low, they're sustainable, that the problem we have is a revenue problem. At slide 35, it is critical now for us, even in this forum, to discuss how to fix our revenue challenges, because cutting expenditure currently is not a viable option, as our public expenditure to GDP ratio is again one of the lowest in the African leading economies. We must, however, continue to rationalize expenditure, as we cannot afford any wastages. In reality, the largest expenditure items are currently personnel, debt service, as well as capital expenditure. Between these three, when you put them together, is 85% of total federal government expenditure in the 2022 budget. There is very little scope to cut in any of this over the medium-term period. So what we must do is to increase the revenues. The most viable solution to our fiscal challenges, therefore, remains for us to grow our revenues and block leakages. Our target over the medium term is to grow our revenue to GDP ratio, which is currently at 8 to 9% of GDP. We must grow it to 15% by the year 2025. At the current level of revenues, the debt service to revenue ratio, if we reach this 15%, will cease to be of any critical concern for the country. In January 2019, the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning launched the Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative. This is an initiative that had major initiatives that were designed to ensure that we meet and limit our fiscal gaps. The systematic resource mobilization problem has been compounded by a recent economic recession. So while we had started to progress, 2020 incidence of COVID-19 had seen us stepping back, but we have now moved back to the pre-pandemic levels. Several measures were being instituted under the administration's Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative to improve government revenue, to entrench fiscal prudence with emphasis on achieving value for money. These measures include the improving tax administration framework, including tax filing and payment compliance improvements. Other measures include the evaluation of the processes and policy effectiveness of fiscal incentives. This includes review of sectors that are eligible for things like pioneer certificates, incentives under the Industrial Development Income Tax Relief, (IDITRA). We also worked on dimensioning the cost of tax waivers, concessions, and evaluating their policy effectiveness, and we're looking at what to scale back on and cut back on to preserve revenue. We're also setting annual ceilings on tax expenditures to better manage their impact on already constrained government revenues. We're working to ensure that MDAs appropriately account for and remit their internally generated revenues. Other measures that are encapsulated in the SRGI include identifying and plugging existing revenue leakages to enhance compliance and reduce tax evasion, leveraging technology and automation, plugging fiscal drainers like subsidies. To further enhance independent revenue collection, government aims to optimize the operational efficiencies and revenue generation focus of the government-owned enterprises. The introduction of new and further increases in existing pro-health taxes, for example, excise duties on carbonated drinks. This is work in progress, but it will happen in the 2021 Finance Act. Government's revenue performance and remittances will become enhanced through the effective implementation of the performance management framework, including possible sanctions should there be defaults on targets that are set for government-owned enterprises. Tighter expenditure control include the enforcement of the Finance Act provision. The Finance Act 2020 made a provision limiting government-owned enterprises' expenditure to revenue ratio at 50. That is to say, these agencies cannot spend more than 50% of what they generate. And that's one major revenue that will be coming into the government treasury. Regular independent monitoring and reporting of revenue and expenditure performances by both the Budget Office of the Federation as well as the Office of the Accountant General of the Federation. The Finance Bill 2021 will contain measures that will further advance the implementation of the Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative, the SRGI. At slide 41 is to show the revenue improvements that we have witnessed from 2017 to 2021 in terms of independent revenues. That is revenues from government-owned enterprises. The trend you can see is an upward one, and the values are indicated. They're too small even for me to see from here, but the trend is an upward trend and is a very positive one. The trend in the graph shows a steady improvement of our independent revenues over the years. As at August 2021, we have surpassed all the collection targets for federal government independent revenues from 2017 to date. This reflects the performance of our revenue growth initiatives to this particular revenue stream. At the current rate, we are now firmly in a position to surpass the 1 trillion naira mark collection from independent revenue sources. Analysts have always considered our projections to be unrealistic, but we have always insisted on the potentials that exist to grow federal government independent revenue, and this is fact. So the reality is showing that we are vindicated. Next is to present to you some allocations in the 2022 budget relating to some critical sectors. So first of all, the education sector at slide 43 is receiving 1.290 trillion. This is 7.9% of the total budget. And this includes 875.93 billion, which is provided for the ministry and its agencies. This is their capital and recurrent expenditure. 108 billion provided for Universal Basic Education Commission, UBEC, as well as 306 billion for TET Fund. For the health sector, I'm glad the Honorable Minister of Health is here, so if you have any questions, it's to the Minister. We made a provision of 711.28 billion naira. This is for the ministry, its agencies, capital and recurrent, including hazard allowances for the medical personnel. We also provided 54.87 billion for Gavi immunization funds, including counterpart funding for donor-supported programs, including Global Fund. We also provided 54.05 billion transfer to the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund. So the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund has been on statutory transfer since 2020, which means it's on autopilot. They get the 1% of the CRF. Other critical sectors include defense and security, 2.41 trillion. This is 15% of the national budget. And this amount has been provided for the military, police, intelligence services, as well as paramilitary services. This is both their capital and recurrent. We also make provisions of 1.451 trillion for infrastructure. This is representing 8.9% of the budget, and this includes provisions for power works and housing, transport, water resources, and aviation. The social development sector got a provision of 863 billion. This represents 5.3% of the budget. This amount is provided for the social investment program, as well as the new National Poverty Reduction and Growth Strategy program. So to round up, The 2022 budget is expected to further accelerate the growth of the Nigerian economy. We are optimistic that attaining more inclusive growth as we focus on achieving our objectives of mass job creation and lifting millions of citizens out of poverty. Early passage of the 2022 bill for implementation by 1st of January will significantly contribute towards achieving government macro-fiscal and sectoral objectives. However, revenue currently remains our main fiscal challenge, and we're putting all efforts to make sure that the strategic revenue growth initiative targets are met. In addition to the SRGR, we are also leveraging on technology, automation, plugging fiscal drainers, and ensuring more effective independent revenue monitoring. Efforts are also being made at addressing revenue leakages. Other efforts include the ongoing implementation of the IPPIS, the dimension of cost of tax waivers, and promoting policy dialogue and transparency around tax waivers. Also, elimination of regressive subsidies such as the fuel subsidy and electricity tariffs, the cost-to-income ratio capping of the government-owned enterprises, I earlier said, is 50-50 expenditure to revenue. Achieving government's budget objectives require collective, bold, decisive, and urgent action, and government is determined to continue to push the bar. However, government remains mindful of the need to provide safety nets to cushion the impact of reforms on vulnerable segments of our population. The goal of fiscal interventions will be to keep the economy active through carefully calibrated regulatory policy measures designed to boost domestic value addition, to de-risk enterprise environments, to attract external investments, and also to widen our sources of funding. A list of some of the key projects included in the 2022 budget, apart from the earlier ones I've presented, are also attached as an appendix to this presentation. So the purpose of this forum is for us to harness citizens' participation and feedback in enhancing budget for 2022, but also to remind you that we do have on the website of the Budget Office an iMonitor, as well as a citizen budget monitoring app available on the website that you can also download on your phone and be able to interact on performance of government projects. Key projects in the 2022 budget are presented again in this report as an appendix. Details of the executive proposal will be available on the website of the Budget Office as well as the website of the Federal Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning. So I will want to ask the presenters to continue to show the appendices. If you go to the appendix, you will see slide 53, aviation, rail, power, housing, industry, trade and investment, Niger Delta, health, continuous social investment, regional investment, works, so we have roads, bridges, education, you see some of the major projects, water resources, some of the major projects, education and others. So on this note, I want to say thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning.